Hello everyone, welcome back. So in part three here, we're going to pick up and we're going to continue our discussion. And in particular, we're going to focus in on the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So we've alluded to these a couple of times now, and now we're going to get into some more of the detail with each of these. So the first one that we're going to discuss is the parasympathetic division, right? So when you think of the parasympathetic division broadly, you can think of things like rest and digest, or you can think of the term feed and breed, all right? So this has to do with times in which we are having a low kind of metabolic rate. So we're going to be resting just after we have consumed food. When we're sleeping, we're largely in a parasympathetic state. During different phases of the reproductive cycle, we are in a parasympathetic state. We're also in a sympathetic state for some of those. But in general, you can think of this term rest and digest. Now, the outflow of parasympathetic nervous system, we've referred to outflow a few times. The outflow is what's called craniosacral, right? So if you think of the term cranio, right? Cranio refers to cranium, meaning head, and then sacral is referring to the sacral part of the spinal cord, right? So low down beneath the lumbar region, right? So this means that the areas or the regions of outflow that give rise to parasympathetic branches or neurons and nerves is from the head region, cranial region, and from the sacral region, right? And that's what you can see on the graph to the left, right? So for the cranial part, if you think of the cranium, the head, the nerves that are in the head region are our cranial nerves, right? And in particular, we have four cranial nerves, or four pair, right? There's one on the left, one on the right, but four cranial nerves that give rise to parasympathetic outflow, right? These are going to be cranial nerve 3, our oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 7, our facial, cranial nerve 9, our glossopharyngeal, and then cranial nerve 10, our vagus nerve, right? The the sacral part, so the sacral part of craniosacral outflow, are what are called pelvic splanchnic nerves. And we'll talk about what the term splanchnic means here in just a second. But these splanchnic nerves, these pelvic splanchnic nerves, come from S2, S3, and S4 spinal cord levels, right? A way I like to remember it, and this is how I learned it in grad school, PS, pelvic splanchnic, are parasympathetic. So parasympathetic, PS, pelvic splanchnic, PS, right there. That's one way you can kind of remember that. So if we look at these, and we start with our cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 3, this is oculomotor. This is sending preganglionic. So if you're unsure of what preganglionic, that term is new to you, go back and watch one of the previous parts of this lecture to understand what preganglionic and postganglionic means. So for all of these, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10, the preganglionic fibers start in these neurons, right? They start in these nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10. So for 3, oculomotor nerve, preganglionic fibers leave here that are destined for largely the eye, right? So oculomotor means moving the eye. Cranial nerve 3 does move the eye. It gets some of our extraocular muscles, but it also has autonomic fibers in its nerve. So parasympathetic fibers. This goes out to our eye to control the shape of the lens. So whenever we are accommodating, right, we're looking at something far, we're looking at something close. These are this action is controlled by the autonomic nerves in the third cranial nerve. You also have autonomic fibers, parasympathetic fibers going out to control the muscles in the iris that allow our pupil to dilate. So whenever we causes it to constrict. So whenever our pupils are constricting, they're getting smaller. A muscle called the sphincter pupillae or the pupillary sphincter muscle. This is causing the pupil to get a little bit smaller, right? Cranial nerve 7, this is our facial nerve. This is sending autonomic parasympathetic fibers to many of our salivary glands, right? So our submandibular as well as our sublingual salivary glands. It's also sending fibers to our lacrimal gland as well. And the lacrimal gland is what is ultimately producing lacrimal fluid, which we can typically think of as being tears, right? Cranial nerve 9 here, the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is sending parasympathetic autonomic fibers to what's called the parotid gland, and the parotid gland is another salivary gland. So if you look here, this gland here, this is our parotid, and then here we have sublingual and submandibular, but this is cranial nerve 9 going out to parotid gland, right? So to produce saliva. And then cranial nerve 10 is our vagus nerve. This is a big nerve. So the cranial nerve 10, vagus means wanderer or wandering, right? Now, this is sometimes called the wandering nerve because cranial nerve 10 innervates structures in the head and neck region. It innervates structures in the thorax. it also innervates structures in the abdomen. So it wanders throughout the body, so it's aptly named the wandering nerve or the vagus nerve, right? So you can see here, autonomic innervation to the heart, to the lungs, so thoracic cavity, and then our parts of our digestive system, regions called the foregut and the hindgut. You'll talk about those. I'm sorry, foregut and the midgut. You'll talk about those in AMP2. So when you look at the details of the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic fibers, and the preganglionic fibers in this instance are all of these blue ones here, right? These blue fibers coming out here in the cranial nerves, as well as these in the sacral. Or I'm sorry, I completely forgot to talk about pelvic splanchnic nerves. These come out, preganglionic fibers go in a synapse onto structures of the hindgut, so distal parts of the large intestine, as well as the reproductive and some of our urinary system structures. Okay, so back to what I was saying. So when you look at these preganglionic fibers, in the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic are long, okay? They're very long, and then they synapse with a postganglionic neuron that's relatively short, right? So knowing that, if you know that the preganglionic is long, and you can look at these, just look at this blue one here for the cranial nerve 10, right? Trace it out, super, super, super long, and then these red dots represent the postganglionic. So they're relatively short, right? They're very short. So knowing that, you have a long preganglionic and you have a short postganglionic, where does that mean the ganglia is? It means that it's close to the target organ. It's close to the effector, right? So these preganglionic neurons synapse with ganglia that are sometimes called intramural ganglia, right? Meaning close to or within the wall of the organ, right? Now these up here for cranial nerves 3, 7, and 9, they're not called intramural ganglion because they have a different name because they're further away. But in this case, cranial nerve 10, you notice that it goes all the way up to the organ, into the structure, then synapses with the postganglionic, and then the postganglionic continues to the organ and stimulates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, whatever it may be. Okay, so keep in mind, long preganglionic, short postganglionic, and parasympathetic, and the ganglia is close to the target organ, right? So if we look now, we can look at the sympathetic, right? And the sympathetic is largely going to be the opposite of the parasympathetic. So this is our quote unquote fight or flight division. This is being activated in cases of emergency, exercise, stress, excitement, things like that. The outflow here, whereas parasympathetic was called craniosacral, sympathetic is called thoracolumbar, meaning we outflow from the thorax or from the thoracic region of the spinal cord down to the lumbar region, specifically L2. So we go from T1 all the way down to L2. So if you're above T1, you do not have sympathetic outflow. If you are below L2, you do not have sympathetic outflow, right? The preganglionic fibers in the sympathetic division are short relative to the postganglionic fibers that are long, right? This means that the ganglia are further away from the target organ or the effector, whereas whenever we looked at the parasympathetic, that ganglia was very close because you had a very short postganglionic but a very long preganglionic fiber, right? The big thing with the sympathetic, or one of the big things, is something called the sympathetic chain, right? So here you see brainstem, here you see spinal cord in the middle, and then off to either side you see this structure, right? You see this structure here. In parasympathetic, you don't see it, right? But in sympathetic, you see this long structure here. This is called the sympathetic chain, and this is where some, not all, but this is where some of our preganglionic sympathetic fibers synapse before the postganglionic travels out to the effector organ, right? So we'll look at that here in just a second. Hopefully you can see in this chain, you kind of see these bulbous swellings that kind of protrude out on either side. You can see it on both sides of the spinal cord here. Those are called sympathetic chain ganglia, right? So if we look at this, we see something very similar, right? So just for orientation, spinal cord here, sympathetic chain here. So this chain that we're looking at here, that's the same chain that we looked at in this image right here. So this chain equates to this chain here, right? And then you can see those ganglia, those kind of swellings of cell bodies, right? And remember, it's a ganglia because we're outside the central nervous system. We're outside the spinal cord and the brain. So with this, you have a number of different pathways that the sympathetic neurons can take, all right? all of them are going to start off basically the same, right? What they're going to do is they're going to be the preganglionic cell body of the sympathetic neurons will exist in this lateral horn of gray matter. So note that you have this dorsal horn, you have this ventral horn, and then you have this lateral horn, okay? Because this is where the sympathetic preganglionic cell bodies are, you're only going to find this in regions where you have sympathetic outflow, and that's that thoracolumbar, T1 to L2. So if you look at a section of spinal cord and you do not see lateral horn, you know you're either above T1 or you're below L2 because those regions aren't involved with sympathetic outflow. Okay, so all preganglionic sympathetic neurons start lateral horn, come out through this white matter, enter into the ventral root, enter into a spinal nerve, and then promptly leave the spinal nerve and pass through this small branch here called a white ramus. Sometimes you'll see it called a white ramus communicans. Right? So this white ramus, you can see it labeled down here, it's called white because this region is myelinated. Right? So this is where the fibers pick up their myelin, and then they enter into this sympathetic chain ganglia here. Right? From the sympathetic chain ganglia, you can have a number of things happen. Right? One, you can synapse at that level. Okay, so note that the blue synapse is here, and then you leave through something called a white ramus communicans. You go back into the spinal nerve, and then you go out to the effector. Right? You go to the heart, you go to the lungs, stomach, intestines, bladder, wherever. Right? So you could synapse at that level and then leave. You could come in through the white ramus. Again, this was called the gray ramus. This one here is the white ramus. Come in through the white ramus, go up, then synapse, and then leave through the gray ramus. You could come in, go down, synapse, and then leave through the gray ramus. Or you could come in to the ganglia, not synapse, pass out of the sympathetic chain, out of the sympathetic ganglia without synapsing, and synapse at some other ganglia that are called collateral or sometimes are called prevertebral ganglia. Right? Or a prevertebral ganglion, right? So either way, whatever route you take, you go up, you go down, you go out to some other ganglion, you have to synapse at some point, right? Remember we said autonomic system, it's a 2-neuron pathway in the lower motor neuron. You have a preganglionic, you have a postganglionic. So you have to synapse somewhere. But where you synapse depends on really where that nerve is destined to go. Is it going to the heart? Is it going to the stomach? Is it going to the intestines, the kidney, the bladder, wherever? All right. So with this, you can have multiple um, neurons, multiple nerves of the sympathetic nervous system go to different effectors, right? So this is something called mass activation. And you can think of mass activation in a very easy example that we give in class often is if you get scared, right? If you get scared, somebody scares you, you are in an activated sympathetic state, right? Think about what happens whenever you get scared, right? First thing you can probably think of, your heart rate goes up, right? You check your pulse, you notice that your heart is racing. You may start to sweat a little bit, start to cool you down. Your blood pressure probably goes up. Your respiratory rate certainly went up as well. Your pupils probably dilated and got larger so you can gather in more light, right? This is called mass activation. You get many changes in different organ systems. You probably had a shunting of blood away from your GI tract towards your muscles. For contraction, maybe you need to run away or you need to flee, right? You need to fight or flight. You have all these different things happening at the same time that are all coordinated together, right? And so this is referred to as mass activation, right? So keep in mind the sympathetic ganglia, right? And the sympathetic chain, you can see it here on this right image highlighted in red, okay? This is the sympathetic chain, right? So this sympathetic chain exists on either side of the vertebral column. So this is the aorta. Right here, this would be the diaphragm, kind of up here. This general region, deep to some of this musculature and connective tissue and nervous tissue, you'd have the vertebral column. So on either side of the vertebral column, you have this chain that is called the sympathetic chain. In gross dissection, it kind of looks like this loose, stringy object. It's kind of grayish yellow in color. It's certainly not red, and it doesn't look as obvious as this. Okay. Now you also see these other red structures here. You see this little ganglia here, you see this one here, and you see this one up here. Those are the prevertebral or the collateral ganglion that we mentioned here, right? So these can have neurons, so you can notice that there are neurons and nerves leaving these. You can synapse in those, and then based on which one you synapse at, if you're a preganglionic sympathetic neuron, you'll then go to a different part of the GI tract largely, right? These are named, these three red here, these are named the celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, and the inferior mesenteric ganglion. They are named according to the artery that they're near, right? So if this is called the celiac ganglion, this is called the celiac trunk. This is the superior mesenteric ganglion, this is the superior mesenteric artery, and this is the inferior mesenteric ganglion, this is the inferior mesenteric artery, right? In A&P2, you'll learn about those blood vessels. And so if you know the names of these ganglion and where they're at, when you get to blood vessels in A&P2 and you talk about these, you'll already know their names because you knew the names of the ganglia that were associated with them from A&P1, right? And so this blue line here on the left image, this is showing the sympathetic chain. And then from here, we can go out and go to some effector, right? So notice celiac ganglion, you go to certain organs. Superior mesenteric ganglion, you go to other organs. And then inferior mesenteric ganglion, you go to, again, other organs, okay? So depending on where the preganglionic fibers come from, depending on where they synapse, they're going to go to some particular organ, all right? Okay, so we will stop here with this part. I know we only went over a few slides, but we talked for a long time. There's a lot of detail with this, so make sure you cover it, go over it several times. We'll stop here, and we will pick up with the next part, talking about the physiology and something called dual innervation.